Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. So today we're doing a lore summary of the last book in the Vigilus season, Warzone Nachmund, The Rift War. This write-up was by Shaskais. Again, I'll include the link to his Reddit down in the description of the video. Please go over and say thank you, because without him, this video would not be possible. So let's jump in and let's start with the introduction into this book. So by command of War Master Abaddon, Haarken Worldclaimer, known as the Herald of the Apocalypse, has been entrusted with the mightiest host of the Black Legion. His task is to claim the Nachmund gauntlet in the name of Abaddon the Despoiler. Abaddon recognizes the strategic importance of the Nachmund gauntlet. By securing it, Abaddon gains unrestricted access for his armies to flow into the Imperium Sanctus. Also, any attacks on the gauntlet would draw Imperial armies from elsewhere in the Imperium, leaving many Imperial regions bereft of their much needed garrisons. So far, Vigilus has defied the wrath of the War Master. The Imperial forces there, empowered by their renewed faith, have become ascendant and asserted a measure of order on their war-ravaged world. However, in truth, Vigilus mattered little to Abaddon, for his gaze was on the wider strategic picture. Abaddon wanted the gauntlet, and his real step in conquering it was revealing the fallen world of Darovar, which was currently under siege by Imperial forces. And this brings us to Chapter 1, Siege of Darovar. Now, Darovar is the home world of a fallen night house known as Mandrakor, and has proved to be a threat to the Imperial shipping in the Nachmund Gauntlet since the first Imperial ships started navigating it. This made the world a priority target for the Castellans of the Rift. The Castellans of the Rift are a Space Marine Primaris chapter assigned by the risen Primarch Rebuta Gilliman with the task of pacifying the Gauntlet. It was a duty that the chapter took to heart, though it very much overstretched them. The chapter master of the Castellans, known as Barstein Grix, sent a call for aid to their cousin Marine chapters, and this call was answered. Space Marine chapters from within and without the war zone gathered around the Castellans of the Rift to form the Wardens of the Gauntlet. With such number of Marines at their side, Chapter Master Grix believed that an invasion of Darovar was now possible. The Marines called upon further Imperial forces to join them. The Space Marines were reinforced by hosts of Battle Sisters, Imperial Guard regiments, Imperial Knight Lances, and squadrons of Imperial Navy. All were eager to see Imperial justice be delivered to the traitor knights. Even for such a mighty assemblage of Imperial forces, invading Darovar was a daunting proposition. The world was located close to the edge of the Great Rift, making encircling and surrounding it near impossible. Enormous fields of debris created from ships destroyed by the traitor knights or had been ejected out of the Great Rift made access to the world even more difficult. The fields were infested by cultists, Xenos, and traitors that were left to their own devices by House Mandrakor. These groups of renegades and aliens would wage a guerrilla warfare against any Imperial force attempting to navigate the field. The Dark Mechanicus Forge Moon Omega Frex was also located within the system, and its heretics were long-standing allies of House Mandrakor. They had planted void mines within the debris fields in this event. Darovar came under attack. They would send supplies and additional forces to aid their night allies. Complicating things even further was the fact that several warp anomalies defended the world, allowing for only a few and narrow space routes for large forces to assault the planet. If an attacking force managed to navigate their way to the planet's surface, their task would not be any easier. The world was twisted by chaos, making it hostile and demon-haunted. In addition to that, the traitor knights did not stand alone. The hardly population of Darrofor was fearful and fiercely loyal to their knightly masters. Millions were sworn to give their lives for House Mandracore. Packed allied traitor warbands would come to the aid of the traitor knights, bringing with them their own cultists and armies along with demon engines. But it did not matter, because Chapter Master Grix led an attack anyway. He ordered the largest of the Imperial fleet ships to form the tip of the spear, while the transports followed closely behind. As the Imperial fleet closed on the target, ships broke off to form cordons around the debris field to blunt any attacks against the transports from them. Their additional task was to maintain a pathway for the Imperial retreat. Surgical assaults of Marines and Tempestus Scions were deployed in the field to prevent any flanking attacks. Chapter Master Grix then ordered an elite troop force to launch a flanking maneuver around the world to intercept any supplies from Omega Frex. The Imperial fleet smashed its way through the orbital obstacles and defences and deployed its forces. The ground assault made gains and secured landing areas before launching attacks at what was to be believed the traitors' primary holdings. The Imperials were met with a fierce resistance. Though the Imperials had a numerical advantage, the warp-blasted terrain of the world made the planet highly defensible. The cave networks that ran between the traitor fortresses made pinning down enemy forces extremely difficult. Every inch of the ground the Imperials secured came at a high cost, and even then to secure the area could be turned hostile by the cave maneuvering of the traitors. The war for Darrofor became a stalemate. The Imperial war machine slowly ground on, while the traitor knights lacked the numbers to secure the defensive victory. But in the shadows of the warp, a mighty armada of thousands of ships was making its way to break the siege of Darrofor. The Black Legion war host led by Haarken Worldclaimer. Haarken was not going to Darrofor to secure a potential ally. Such was the size and might of the forces under his command that the strength of the Night House was nothing but a drop in the ocean. Haarken's true intention was to make Darrofor an anvil on which he was going to break the largest concentration of Imperial forces in the Nachman Gauntlet. Initially, Haarken destroyed any Imperial outpost between him and Darrofor. He quickly saw it to be a folly. Destroying every target in his path would slow him down and break up the cohesion of his forces. So instead, Haarken drew a powerful vanguard force from his armada made up of a loose coalition of traitor marine warbands. They would sail ahead of his armada and act independently. They would wreak havoc and sow discord within the Imperium in preparation for his arrival. In addition to these forces, Haarken sent forth saboteurs, spies, and other forms of covert agents. Their mission was to undermine any potential areas that could slow down the traitors' advance. The quicker Haarken made it south to the Gauntlet, the easier it would be for him to smash through the Sanctus wall and penetrate deeper into the Imperium Sanctus. By the application of rapid and overwhelming force did Haarken plan to achieve his conquest. Abaddon urged Haarken to hasten his campaign, but Haarken knew that to press the attack to the surface would leave his rearguard exposed to the attacks from the Imperial fleet, which would then slow him down. He launched a merciless attack on the rearguard fleet left by Chapter Master Grix to defend the system's Mandeville Point. Had Grix positioned his entire fleet at the Mandeville Point, the Imperial forces might have inflicted terrible losses on the traitor armada as it translated from the warp. But the Imperial fleet was scattered around the system as it overstretched itself to support the ground invasion. So the ships guarding the point stood little chance. Haarken loosed the most vicious and bloodthirsty members of his armada at the Loyalist. World Eater ships, demonically possessed ships, took the forefront of the attack. The World Eaters launched their Ulysses claws and pulled Imperial vessels to be boarded and overrun by rampaging madmen. The Night Lords broadcasted their tortured dying screams of hundreds of their slaves, shattering the minds of Imperial ships' astropaths and crippling their lines of communication. The possessed ships mauled and gnashed the loyalist vessels to death. The Imperial fought this doomed battle with heroism and grim resolve. The desperate fighting was punctuated with acts of sacrifice. A captain of a ship that was trapped within the jaws of a possessed vessel ordered the munitions to be detonated, taking both of the ships and the demonic vessel to oblivion. When the order of retreat was given, after the Loyalists lost half of their numbers, a handful of ships stayed behind to cover them. An Imperial Nemesis-class carrier dove in the middle of an onrushing traitor ships and detonated its warp drives, destroying dozens of traitor ships and damaging dozens more. Some Imperial ships pretended to be neutralized and waited until they were surrounded by traitor vessels before unleashing every weapon they had. Within hours, the Imperial resistance crumbled. The traitor armada flowed uncontested into the system. The surviving Imperial ships and those guarding the debris field fled before this huge traitor armada. Those too slow to escape the massive traitors were either destroyed or captured. With the orbital war over Daravor won, Haarken sent some of his forces to secure the debris field. He would leave nothing to chance. Any cultist or renegade that refused to swear fealty to him was to be destroyed. After sending messages to the High Queen and King of House Mandracore, Haarken moved his forces to their world. Chapter Master Grix was shocked by the colossal Black Legion armada racing towards Daravor. He had never witnessed or heard of such an immense force of traitors before. Even the more experienced commanders of his cousin chapters were aghast at the size of the traitor forces. Victory on Daravor was no longer possible, and a last stand against the traitors would prove to be pointless, since they were unlikely to inflict any lasting damage to the masses of traitors. Victory was now measured by how many Imperial lives they could get off the world and save. Not even the fanatical Sisters of Battle could argue against this logic. Chapter Master Grix and his Space Marines swore that they would be the last to leave the world. Other Marine commanders joined them in that oath. They were determined to make the enemy bleed. Being aware of the Imperial withdrawal, the High Queen and King of House Mandracore launched a series of devastating hit-and-run attacks that saw the strongest of the Imperial defense positions crushed, allowing for their Night House militants to surge forth after the retreating Imperials. The traitor knights and their followers surrounded thousands of Imperial soldiers and butchered them. All over the world, the Imperial retreat lines fell under great pressure. The skies of the world darkened with the shapes of Black Legion landing craft, gunships and landing pogs. Haarken himself descended from the skies at the forefront of a massive flock of Chaos Raptors. Haarken had the resources to destroy the Imperial ships in orbit, but he decided to seek destruction of the Imperial forces on the ground instead. Haarken wanted to assert dominance over House Mandracore. He would not remove the Imperials as a thorn to his side, only to have them be replaced by House Mandracore. Despite the harrowing ordeal, the Imperials gained a small success. For examples, elements of Imperial Guardsmen, Battle Sisters and Space Marines waged a guerrilla campaign within the cave network so successful that it forced the traitors to deploy companies of traitor guardsmen armed entirely with flamethrowers just to burn them out. The traitor masses could not be denied for long, and it poured on the retreating Imperials, surrounding many and drawing them into last stands. Chapter Master Grix and his Marines found themselves in such a desperate situation, and they only managed to escape after cutting their way through a Black Legion warband, losing half of their numbers in the process. Eventually, The Imperials were driven to their landing zones beneath the aerial carnage as overstimmed and exhausted Imperial pilots contended against flying demon engines and traitor aircraft. Soon, the landing zones became fiercely contested battlefields. Not all evacuations could be completed in time before the landing zones were overwhelmed. Disorder reigned as the traitors broke through. Some dropships and landers departed with just a fraction of their capacity, while some others flew so overloaded with men they couldn't break the atmosphere, causing them to fall back to the ground. Countless landers managed to escape the world, their holds filled brim with exhausted and wounded Imperial troops. Chapter Master Grix was among the last to leave the world. His dropship was filled with as many souls as possible. While retreating, 4 Imperial vessels were attacked by the minions of the Haarken Worldclaimer. The wounded and exhausted Imperials on board stood no chance against the Jakari. The Jakari sailed away with their slave holds full. Moving on to Chapter 2, Storming the Gauntlet. After crushing the Imperials at Darovar, his forces salvaged thousands of Imperial armour, guns and weapons. Moreover, House Mandracore and their dark mech allies pledged themselves to his cause. Now it was time to conquer the rest of the Gauntlet. Barely a fifth of the Imperial forces escaped Darovar. The remnant broke apart and scattered all over the Gauntlet. There would be no respite for them, for there was no escape from the war in the Gauntlet. The vanguard forces that Haarken created proved to be an immensely efficient tool. Thanks to their actions, the worlds ahead of the traitor Armada were rendered all but incapable of offering resistance. Some worlds surrendered in hopes of mercy that never came. In some cases, Haarken's forces liberated Imperial worlds from Xenos invaders, resulting in a clueless Imperial citizens throwing their lot of what they believed were the Emperor's Angels of Death. Haarken moved south of the Gauntlet, plundering worlds for slaves and supplies, absorbing heretic forces into their ranks and destroying any who refused to join them. The fortress world of Keriak III was a potential threat to Haarken's rear, so he ordered a 1,000-son trail band to assault the warp surge station that kept the warp route to the planet open, in order to isolate it from the rest of the Natman Gauntlet. The surge station was built around a structure that was older than the Imperium itself. It kept warp storms in check. The Thrallband unleashed a mutagenic curse that reduced the stormtroopers guarding the station into chaos spawns and overran it. The Thrallband with the Dark Mech allies then conducted an arcane ritual that didn't only turn off the technology of the structure, but reversed it. Instead of absorbing chaos energy, the technology unleashed all the warp energy that it had collected over the millennia. Keriak III was drowned in a tidal wave of warp energy. Billions of demons manifested on the planet, and millions of Imperials were turned into spawn. By doing this, the Thrallband went above and beyond what Haarken ordered. World after world fell before the massive Black Legion host, but not all worlds in its path were attacked. Some were of little value as targets or supply stores, so they were left alone. Time was of essence, and Haarken couldn't afford to waste time. Not everything went smoothly for Haarken. The absence of Abaddon meant that maintaining order between the various warbands that made up the Black Legion host was extremely difficult. Their hatred for each other, self-interest, and all-consuming bloodlust proving to be as dangerous for Haarken's cause as any weapon of the enemy. Word of Haarken's advance reached the Imperial commanders in the south. The system around Sanguinar Terra fortified themselves into a bastion called Sanctus Wall. Its task was to absorb the coming traitor onslaught. In application of ruthless strategic calculus, the Imperials drew a line in the Natman Gauntlet. The worlds on the Vigilus side would be left to slow down Haarken's hosts. The worlds of the South line would evacuate to the Sanctus Wall with military assets given priority. Despite the might and size of the Black Legion host, it did not go unchallenged as it sailed southwards. Orc freebooters went after isolated elements of the host. The Eldari of Craftworld Ulfway, Sanhan, and Kinshara launched hit-and-run raids on the host. The Drakari and the Harlequins also joined in with their kin in harassing the traitors. Even traitor warbands assaulted the Black Legion host, having little interest in seeing Haarken succeed. As Haarken's armada drew closer, hope was thin in the Sanctus Wall. The worlds of the wall were in a grip of civil strife, and they didn't have the numbers to withstand the coming storm. However, news arrived that reignited the Imperial's hope. Battle groups Lamberdax of the Indomitus Crusade was making its way to the Sanctus Wall, but it would take some time before it would arrive. By the time the ships translated from the warp, the traitors would have already drenched the Sanctus Wall in its defenders' blood. A Lord Admiral known as Quirin Prissa proposed a solution. She would lead her fleet to a narrow part of a tactical gap in the wall that she would stall the traitors' advance for a few days, long enough for the battle group to arrive. Seeing no other option, the Imperial commanders approved her mission. She was joined by Sisters of Battle and Space Marines. The Sanctus Wall was still nothing more than an idea in the mind of Imperial commanders. Still, Abaddon knew it posed a threat to his plans to conquer the gauntlet should the Imperials succeed in creating it. As Haarken sailed to the south, Abaddon moved his agents to subvert and thwart Imperial efforts to fortify the systems that made up the Sanctus Wall. Wordbearer and Alpha Legion activated their sleeper agents and made contact with desperate and deluded elements in the Imperium populations. Several Imperial Guard regiments turned to Abaddon's side, either launching attacks on their former allies or keeping their conversion to a secret to rot the Imperial defences from within. The Inquisition launched what was locked in a shadow war with the agents of Abaddon and the heretic cells, but for all their success in purging them, there were still so many cells going unnoticed or succeeding in harming the Imperial effort. Even the most stubborn Inquisitor acknowledged that the challenge was too much for them to overcome, though not a single Inquisitor entertained the thought of giving up. To feed the Imperial fortification effort in the Sanctus Wall, nearby planets were drained almost entirely of their forces and supplies, rendering them vulnerable, and indeed, some fell to Xenos invaders and raiders. Moving on to Chapter 3. Battle for the Narrow. Admiral Prissa took most of the Sanctus Wall ships with her, knowing that the Crusaders' battle group would compensate for their loss. She needed a sizable fleet to attract the attention of Haarken. It was a force that Haarken could not afford to ignore, for two reasons. One, if he bypassed it, it would be seen as weak. Two, he would not be foolish enough to leave the vengeful Imperial fleet in the rear of his host. Prissa knew that even though the traitor armada looked ordered, in truth it was a loose coalition of warbands. There was disunity in the swarm of traitors, and she was going to exploit it to turn their massive numbers into a weakness. To aid her in this task, she ordered her fleet to set up void mines, null amplifiers, vox jammers, fire ships, and other forms of disruption ahead of her fleet. The traitor vessels that enter that region would be hopefully struck with confusion and fall into discord. It took many agonizing days waiting on the edge before the first of the traitor ships translated in. These ships were struck by the Imperial disruption traps, sowing confusion and cutting their lines of communication. The traitor ships that came after found themselves in the middle of anarchy. More and more traitor ships started to manifest out of the warp with no pause. The number of traitor ships grew so high and kept growing, still to the point that the loyalist servitors burned out as they attempted to make account of them. A few Imperial ship captains fled rather than face this unstoppable tide. Admiral Prissa came into a full appreciation of the horrifying doom that she was confronting, but she stood steadfast against it. Her disruption attacks delayed the traitor's armada from surrounding and destroying her fleet. Now it was time for the Imperial fleet to take the fight to the traitors. She ordered the fleet to form a diamond-shaped wedge, with the largest ships on each of the edges and the smallest in the centre. Then she ordered the Imperial fleet to charge into the traitor armada. First blood went to the Imperials as the wedge ships fired salvo after salvo into the mass ranks of traitor vessels. Prissa's plan ensured that the majority of the traitor armada could not fire at her fleet without hitting their own forces. However, the charge into the heart of the traitor armada was not without losses. The traitor marines were experienced and brutal void fighters. They would not easily be undone. The Imperial fleet lost some of its number in the charge, either blown apart or boarded by vengeful Chaos Marines. Despite the losses, the Imperial fleet fought their way through the traitor armada and broke out on the other side. The Imperial ships then broke left and right, unleashing waves of fighters and bombers at the rear of the Chaos fleet. This enraged the captains and Chaos Marines of the Chaos host, and they sought to break the formation to engage the Imperial ships. They were hammering them in the hill and run maneuvers while invading their return fire. Haarken reinserted order on the host. The Imperial fleet was too small to defeat his host, but he would not allow the bloodlust of his warlords to cause unnecessary damage to his forces. Prissa exploited the discord in the traitor armada in full. The objective of her fleet was to prolong the battle for as much as possible. Kills were secondary to staying alive. Kills were as good, but they meant nothing if they couldn't buy enough time for the Sanctus Wall. The Imperial ships covered and supported each other. Each time one of the ships was surrounded by heretic vessels, a daring counterattack allowed the ship to wiggle free. Space Marines launched heroic attacks on traitor vessels and launched rescue missions to rescue isolated Imperial ships. Haarken was most impressed with the determination and courage of the Imperials. They achieved a glorious kill ratio. They had fought well. He would give them that. They prevented the traitors' efforts to overwhelm and surround them, but that would not last forever. Their numbers were growing smaller and smaller by the minute. Now it was time for Haarken to end it. The immense size of Haarken's host meant that Haarken could shift the position of hundreds of ships without hindrance from the Imperials. Haarken started to move the unengaged left portion of his host. While this was happening, he allowed the Imperials to believe that they were doing well. After hours of fighting, Haarken's host was positioned to form an enormous jaw that was ready to close around the Imperial ships. Haarken gave the order, and hundreds of ships on both sides bore down on the Imperial fleet. One by one, the Imperial ships were overwhelmed, with a few Imperial vessels managing to flee the slaughter. The battle was over. Epilogue. The survivors of Prissa's fleet returned to report their defeat to the Imperial command of the Sanctus Wall. They reported that Prissa had surely died taking the fight to the arch enemy. They also reported the horrifying size of the traitor armada. Any losses they inflicted on it meant little, especially since the traitors had captured plenty of Imperial ships during the battle. The survivors learnt that their mission was a success. They had bought enough time for the Crusade battle group to arrive and reinforce the Sanctus Wall systems. Moreover, the delay they caused in the Narrow allowed for more evacuating Imperial forces from the gauntlet to arrive to the Sanctus Wall and lend their strength. In honour of her sacrifice, Lord Admiral Prissa was named a Saint, and a mighty battleship was named in her honour. News of the size of Haarken's host disturbed Imperial commanders. Even with the arrival of the new battle group, victory was far from certain. Even should they defeat Haarken, there was no telling of other threats that would follow in his wake. Despite Imperial efforts, the Chaos Cells and traitor guardsmen continued to plague the Sanctus Wall worlds. The Imperial oppressive attempts at rooting them out to have ironically pushed the loyalist citizens into defiance. Haarken proclaimed to his host that he would not take his rightful share of the plunder of the Battle of the Narrow. The glory of that battle belonged to his warlords, and its rewards were theirs. Some would think Haarken was weak for this act of generosity. All the better for Haarken, it would reveal those among his host who are more likely to betray him. And after all, once a Sanctus wall is broken, there would be plenty of plunder and slaves. So many prizes and rewards to claim, but what Haarken coveted the most of all was the praise of War Master Abaddon for a task well done. But Haarken did lie. He kept a single prize from the Battle of the Narrow, a certain Lord Admiral who's currently enjoying the hospitality of his torture cells. She knew much and is determined to squeeze her of everything she knew. The desperation of the forces thrown at him in the Narrow proves that his strategy is working. He is moving faster than the Imperium can react to him. He has crossed the gauntlet and now the wall is within reach. Once it falls, the Imperium Sanctus would be laid bare before the Black Legion. Imagining all the carnage and suffering he would unleash upon the Imperium, Haarken ordered his host to make the warp jump to the Sanctus Wall. And that is it. That is the lore summary of Wars of Nachmund, the Rift War. This is, again, the last book in the Vigilus season. It seems that we are going to be getting another season, which is taking place in the Sanctus now. Actually, on the doorstep of Terror, everything like that, that's going to be going on. So it is going to be a bit of a battle. It seems like, well, it seems to me that Chaos has kind of won the War of the Gauntlet, or they're about to win the War of the Gauntlet. This massive, huge force of Chaos Space Marines descending upon down. Seems interesting. Interesting times for Chaos. I am interested to see where they go with this and what they do with this. Is Abaddon going to play more of a worldly part? I would have expected Abaddon to be more involved in this. I thought Abaddon would be taking Haarken's place. So yeah, it's interesting to see what they do with Haarken and Abaddon going forward. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts, feedback, anything like that. If you want to share anything, thank you for joining me at this point in the video. If you're still around, I think we're like nearing 30 minutes or something now. So yeah, absolute madness, this one. Thank you once again. Have a good one. Again, thank you for Shaskais. The link to his Reddit is in the description of this post. Have a great day. See you now, and bye-bye.